In the glorious, simpler, sepia-toned yesteryear of 2003, Nintendo was still willing to take off their punch gloves and, like Frank Reynolds,
get real weird with it.
In fact, back then, innovation was still the name of the game, as with Mario and Luigi Superstarsaga, the name of this game, the Mario RPG was going mobile for the very first time on the Game Boy Advance. And advancement was in the game's DNA, tossing out serious hallmarks and bringing new concepts into play, bringing Luigi into the fold, taking the Mario Brothers out of the Mushroom Kingdom, turning the game into an outright comedy, and taking the already innovative action commands pioneered in Super Mario RPG, on this channel, Smurpglots, to an even higher, simultaneously controlled level. And not only did these innovations work, they came together in such delightful proportion as to create a beloved classic, a franchise launcher that beget a series of all-time, and some not-so-all-time RPG follow-ups.